There are moments in a person's life that seem insignificant at first. They slip into existence quietly, like a piece of junk mail, a voicemail you never return, a notice pinned to the door where you rarely look. For Valerie Hayes, that moment was a thick envelope taped to the peeling paint of her front door, trapped beneath a sun-bleached piece of Scotch tape. It was so ordinary that any reasonable person would have assumed it was just another quarterly reminder from the neighborhood HOA. But the weight of it was wrong. The tone was wrong. And from the moment she opened it, nothing in her life or the lives of anyone in Oak Ridge Pines would ever be the same again. The notice didn't ask. It demanded. It stated that she owed $4,272 in unpaid HOA fines. It listed violations that she had never received warnings for, fees that seemed invented, late charges applied to charges she didn't know existed. Her mailbox wasn't overflowing with ignored letters. She wasn't behind on her dues. She had never once been warned about her flower beds, the paint color on her shutters, or the height of her grass. Yet here it was, $4,272 and a threat of lien and foreclosure if she didn't comply within 30 days. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't ignorant. She was a quiet, middle-income homeowner who paid every bill on time. Her home was all she had left after her divorce, her place of emotional refuge, her one constant. So when the board tried to take it, they didn't just file a lien. They lit a fuse. Valerie sat at her kitchen table long after the neighborhood went silent, long after porch lights blinked off one by one. The envelope sat in front of her like a predator watching its prey. She flipped through every page, read every sentence 3 times, then 4, then 10, searching for logic where there was none. She made lists. She compared dates. She dug through old emails, newsletters, and meeting minutes. It didn't make sense. The dates of the alleged violations didn't match any previous correspondence. In fact, she had never received the required violation notices at all. Someone had skipped the rules. Someone had wanted to skip the rules. And it was no accident. The HOA was infamous in whispers. A group of tight-knit board members who controlled the budget but never shared the numbers. Dues had quietly increased over the years, but no improvements were ever seen. The landscaping company was recommended by the president's brother-in-law. The association lawyer was a college friend. Fines were handed out like parking tickets in a tourist town, frequent, inconsistent, and oddly profitable. Most residents paid without fighting. Some just moved away. A few hired lawyers and lost. But no one challenged the board itself. No one, until now. The following morning, Valerie didn't call the number listed on the notice. She didn't request clarification. She didn't beg for mercy. Instead, she spent 3 hours reading the HOA bylaws, then another 3 researching state HOA laws. By noon, she already knew what most people didn't. The board had broken their own procedures. They had violated their charter. They had violated state law. And if they pushed this any further, she could take them down. That realization should have comforted her. It didn't. Because it also meant that someone did this on purpose. Someone thought she wouldn't fight back. Someone wanted her house. And if they were bold enough to try it with her, how many others had already been steamrolled quietly? That night, Valerie began to dig deeper into public records, into property tax filings, into quiet lawsuits that had come and gone over the last decade. Pattern after pattern emerged. Families fined into foreclosure. Homes sold at auction to people connected to board members. Repeat buyers appearing again and again. An HOA with the power to seize property, run by people with everything to gain and nothing to lose. They hadn't just broken the law. They had weaponized it. The next HOA election was in 3 months. Most residents didn't attend meetings, let alone vote. The same board members had been re-elected for years uncontested, unchallenged, unquestioned. They ran the HOA like a private business, and the residents were just their customers. But for the first time, Valerie saw a way out. Not through lawyers. Not through complaints. But through power. She circled a line in the bylaws in red ink. A single rule that changed everything. Any member of the association in good standing may run for a position on the board. She smiled for the first time in days. She was in good standing, at least, legally. Those made-up fines hadn't been proven, hadn't been validated, and until they were, she was still eligible. They wanted to take her home. She would take their throne. She didn't tell her neighbors yet. She didn't announce anything online. She simply began to prepare. She learned how elections were run. She studied the board's patterns. She watched recorded Zoom meetings, most of them empty except for the same self-satisfied faces. She made notes, asked quiet questions, and drafted a plan. She wasn't just going to win. She was going to expose every secret they had hidden for the past 10 years. But change doesn't arrive quietly. It enters like a storm, violent, loud, and impossible to ignore. And the first sign of that storm arrived 3 days later, when a second letter was taped to her door. This one wasn't a notice. It was a warning. The paper was blank except for a single sentence, typed in block letters. Drop it. There was no signature. No logo. No address. Just fear. But fear works only on those who still have something left to lose. Valerie had already lost her peace. She had already lost her patience. And now, they had taken away her silence. She left the note where it was, taped to the door like a trophy. The next morning, she mailed her candidacy application, certified mail, signature required. And then she waited. Not for their approval, but for their panic. The board was about to learn a lesson they had never been taught. There is nothing more dangerous than someone who knows the rules, and is finally ready to play. The moment Valerie submitted her candidacy, she knew she wasn't just entering an election, she was stepping into a battlefield none of her neighbors even realized existed. The HOA board operated like a silent monarchy. 4 years, their power wasn't questioned because they made sure no one ever learned how to question it. Every complaint disappeared into closed session minutes. Every vote was held at inconvenient hours. Every rule was vague unless they needed it to be precise. And every seat was filled by the same faces speaking the same language of intimidation, exclusivity, and silent threats. If she wanted to win, she couldn't do it with outrage alone. She would need strategy. The first thing she did was study her enemy. She spent hours watching previous board meeting recordings, grainy Zoom videos with board expressions and half-muted microphones. She paid attention to every detail: who spoke the most, who deferred decisions, who seemed nervous, who stayed quiet. The president, Greg Foster, acted like the neighborhood was his personal kingdom. The treasurer, Lorraine Miller, never once shared a document without a fight. The secretary, Joanna Kells, always motioned to approve without asking a single question. The vice president, Mark Jennings, seemed like the only one unsure of what he was part of, an observer trapped on a sinking ship. There was a pattern to their behavior. There was an order. And there were cracks. Before she even considered campaigning, she began speaking to homeowners not about votes, but about their experiences. She listened. Not everyone had been fined. Not everyone had been harassed. But everyone had a story: late responses, unexplained increases in dues, maintenance issues ignored, and whispered frustration with how untouchable the board seemed. For the first time, someone wasn't shrugging and saying, "That's just how HOAs are." Instead, someone finally asked, "Why?" She didn't tell them she was running. Not yet. Instead, she planted a question, one that would grow slowly, deliberately, quietly. "Don't you think someone should do something about this?" Her campaign didn't begin with flyers or lawn signs. It began with a spreadsheet. She mapped the neighborhood, listing every homeowner, every suspected target of fines, every previous foreclosure, every sale tied to a board member's associate. The deeper she dug, the darker it grew. Homes taken through liens had been purchased for fractions of their value and resold for profit. Renters who complained had suddenly received inspection notices. A widowed grandmother had been sued over a broken mailbox that didn't exist. This wasn't incompetence. It was systemic control. And for the first time in its history, Oak Ridge Pines was about to have an election the board couldn't control. 2 weeks after Valerie submitted her paperwork, the board emailed its usual announcement for the upcoming election, an email buried beneath 3 unrelated notices, sent at 10:47 p.m. It listed the same names as always. But at the bottom, for the first time in 10 years, a new candidate appeared. Candidate, Valerie Hayes. Within 24 hours, the rumor mill exploded. Neighbors whispered in driveways. The Facebook community group, which had never been moderated fairly, suddenly had every post mentioning Valerie removed. A new rule appeared overnight requiring board approval for any election-related content. She expected resistance. She expected hostility. But she hadn't expected how quickly the board would reveal its fear. The next board meeting was the first sign. She logged into Zoom early and watched board members attempting small talk that couldn't hide their tension. The moment the attendance list showed her name, conversations halted. Cameras flickered off. Voices dropped to whispers. It wasn't paranoia, she knew full well she was being discussed. Then, for the first time ever, the treasurer presented an updated financial summary. It was vague. It was inconsistent. It was missing years of statements. But it was a response. They were scrambling. The recorded meeting would later go online for everyone to see, and the entire community would watch it again after everything came crashing down. But in that moment, Valerie simply watched and learned every stammer, every delay, every flicker of guilt across Greg's eyes. They were losing their grip. She also knew they wouldn't go down quietly. Within days, her mailbox began to fill. Anonymous letters, suddenly found violation reports, photos of her yard printed in black and white, warnings about unauthorized modifications that never existed. Every tactic was predictable. Every tactic was desperate. And every tactic was documented. She didn't fight back yet. She didn't need to. Everything they were doing now was evidence that she would use. But a campaign requires more than just truth. It needed visibility. So she changed her approach. She began sending private messages and handwritten notes. Not to everyone, just a few. A handful of residents who trusted her. People who weren't afraid. They talked. They shared. They spread rumors of corruption that were no longer rumors. Then something unexpected happened. People began to ask her questions. They wanted clarification. They wanted accountability. They wanted hope. So she gave them something the HOA had never given them. Transparency. She released a statement, not an attack piece, not an emotional outburst, but a calm, professional letter. She outlined her platform in 3 points: financial transparency, fair enforcement, and homeowner rights. She didn't mention the corruption. Not yet. That would come later. But the board noticed. And the board reacted. At the next meeting, an item appeared on the agenda, something small, almost trivial. Update to nomination process and eligibility requirements. It was a last-minute rule change. A desperate attempt to disqualify her. They claimed new requirements for candidates. They must be in full compliance with all active violations, even ones still under dispute. They had written the rule specifically for her. But they had made a fatal mistake. The rule change required member approval, and they had no idea that half the neighborhood was already watching. That night, for the first time ever, attendance on the Zoom meeting doubled. Cameras turned on. Homeowners who had never said a word now listened silently, not quite ready to speak, but no longer willing to disappear. And when the vote came, something miraculous happened. The board didn't have the numbers. The change failed. The chat filled with polite but unmistakable messages of disapproval. The board ended the meeting early. From that moment forward, the election wasn't theoretical. It was real. And now, everyone was watching. Valerie had started her campaign quietly, but the board's panic had amplified it for her. She wasn't just running. She was winning. But deep beneath the victories, something else was happening, something that would reveal itself too late. The more she pushed, the more secrets she discovered. And the more secrets she discovered, the more dangerous her mission became. The HOA wasn't just stealing money, it was laundering it. And when she finally uncovered the truth, the board would do more than threaten her house. They would threaten her life. The deeper Valerie descended into the rabbit hole of Oak Ridge Pines, the clearer it became that the HOA was merely the surface of something far uglier. It was never about landscaping or repairs, or ensuring the community looked presentable. Those things were accessories, props in a show staged to hide the real performance. The violations, the fines, the foreclosures, they were only tools. The goal was profit. Not pennies from late fees, but thousands from stolen homes, quietly transferred assets, and a network of financial relationships that had nothing to do with neighborhood preservation. And in the middle of everything, the board. Most people assumed HOA power came from the bylaws. But real power came from knowledge, and they had counted on no one ever seeking it. Valerie was different. She had motive. She had persistence. And now, she had evidence. It began with a single document, an outdated budget report buried in an online archive that should have been deleted years ago. A mistake. A crack. A breadcrumb. The document didn't match the treasurer's current report. Numbers were missing. Contractors had changed. But the totals remained exactly the same, down to the cent. That kind of perfection was impossible. Unless someone was lying. She began to backtrack every line item, every vendor, every supposed maintenance cost, every expense approval. And the deeper she looked, the more the same companies appeared. Landscaping contracts, power washing, fence repairs, parking enforcement, almost all of them were linked to 3 addresses. All 3 were shell companies, established within months of each other, and all traced back to the same registered agent. Greg Foster's nephew. It was too deliberate to be incompetence. It was intentional fraud, carried out over a decade, disguised beneath a curtain of bureaucracy and intimidation. But something else bothered her, something about the foreclosure cases. It wasn't just the profits. It was the timing. Families were targeted around the same time every year. Many of those homes were sold to the same investment trust before being flipped or rented out. The trust was owned by a holding company, which was managed by the same law firm the HOA used. The HOA board wasn't just mismanaged. It was working with attorneys, investors, and shell companies to seize property under the guise of enforcement, then sell the homes for private gain. And suddenly, the mysterious fines against her made sense. She wasn't just being harassed. She had been selected. A single mother, recently divorced, living alone, no one to defend her, no spare cash to hire an attorney. A perfect target. But they hadn't counted on her refusing to break. The night she fully connected the financial trail, she sat in the glow of her computer screen long after the clock struck 3 a.m. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. She knew what she had to do. She backed up everything. Printed hard copies. Saved flash drives in 3 different locations. Uploaded encrypted copies to the cloud. Then, finally, she did what the board had never expected. She reached out for help. Not lawyers. Not police. Not news outlets. Residents. It began with a small group, people she trusted, people who had already been questioning the board long before she arrived. Some had lost money. Some had lost property. One woman had lost her husband, who died believing they were to blame for their foreclosure when in reality, it had been engineered. They met quietly, offline, in garages, in kitchens, using handwritten notes instead of texts. They shared what they had. They connected their stories. And suddenly, a picture emerged, not of a poorly run HOA, but of an organized racket designed to exploit the most vulnerable. The plan was simple: win the election, seize control of the records legally, and expose everything publicly. But the board was not stupid. The week after her support meetings began, the HOA announced a mandatory yard inspection for the entire community. They issued dozens of violation notices. Suspiciously, every person who had recently spoken with Valerie received at least one. Some received 3. Someone had tipped them off. Trust fractured that night. Fear returned. But this time, fear didn't silence the neighborhood. It strengthened it. People who had once quietly paid in shame now saw themselves among others. The HOA's intimidation tactics no longer functioned in isolation. They backfired. Then something happened that changed the course of the election. A man she had never met knocked on her door carrying a thick folder. He didn't stay long. His voice was quiet, apologetic. He said he had once worked in accounting for one of the shell companies tied to the HOA. He said they forced him to sign documents he didn't understand. He said he had been threatened to stay silent. And then he handed her the folder and left without giving a name. Inside was the missing piece: bank statements. Transfers and payments that proved every suspicion she had. Transfers into personal accounts. Funds marked as maintenance redirected into private investments. A payment labeled consulting sent directly to Greg Foster's wife. It was over. She had enough to bury them. But exposing corruption isn't as simple as having evidence. Power protects itself. Secrets protect themselves. And people who benefit from a broken system will do anything to defend it. The night Valerie began compiling her documents into a final presentation, her power went out. Not the neighborhood's. Just hers. A truck idled in the cul-de-sac. Headlights off. Engine running. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply stared through the blinds until the truck drove away. The board knew she was close. They knew she had proof. And they were starting to panic. The election was now only 3 weeks away. And the people who had stolen homes for profit were now facing the only thing they could not control: exposure. This was no longer just a battle for the presidency. It was a battle for survival. Because in 3 weeks, every homeowner in Oak Ridge Pines would see the truth for themselves. And the board wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. The final weeks leading up to the election felt like a countdown to war. Not with weapons or armies, but with documents, secrets, and the truth itself. In a quiet suburban neighborhood where the biggest argument used to be over mailbox colors and fence heights, a silent revolution was brewing. The HOA board had always assumed they were untouchable. They had assumed no one would ever challenge their power, their methods, or their motives. But power built on intimidation is fragile. And now, for the first time, people weren't just angry, they were organized. Rumors spread across the neighborhood like cracks in glass. People whispered about hidden accounts, fraudulent charges, and homes stolen out from under vulnerable residents. Some whispered too loudly, and word made its way back to the board. But they weren't prepared for how quickly things were changing. The neighborhood had always been passive, but now they were listening, watching, waiting. Valerie didn't run a loud campaign. She didn't need to. The evidence did it for her. As the election approached, she began preparing her final move, one that would ensure the truth couldn't be buried, even if she lost. She arranged a digital event, a community meeting on Zoom open to every homeowner. A meeting that would begin like any other, with mundane agenda items and treasurer reports. But this meeting was different. She wasn't attending passively. She was presenting. She was going to expose the entire system live. The board sensed it. Their fear seeped through every email, every frantic policy update, every attempt to restrict communication. They even tried to cancel the election, first claiming procedural issues, then an unforeseen administrative delay. But the bylaws required elections to proceed unless an emergency was declared. So, the board declared an emergency. A fabricated one. They claimed there was a massive increase in threats against board members, but provided no evidence. They insisted that postponing the election was a safety precaution. But the residents had seen too much. They had watched the new supporters emerge. They had watched the meetings fill. And they no longer accepted silence or excuses. A petition was drafted. Signatures were collected house by house. Not online, but with pen and paper so the board couldn't delete or censor it. The required threshold was met. Under the HOA's own rules, the residents forced the election to continue. It was the first time in the community's history that the board did not control what happened next. But desperation makes people sloppy. And the board had one last card to play. 3 days before the vote, an envelope arrived at Valerie's door. Not taped like before, hand-delivered, shoved into the mailbox. It was from the HOA attorney. A formal cease and desist. They accused her of defamation, incitement, and interference with HOA operations. They demanded she stop campaigning. They gave her 48 hours. She laughed once, not out of arrogance, but disbelief. They still thought intimidation could stop her. They still thought fear worked. That same night, homeowners received glossy flyers in their mailbox. Professional printing. Expensive. The flyers warned that electing an unstable outsider would destroy property values and put the neighborhood at risk. They listed false accusations and cherry-picked information out of context. But the problem was no longer misinformation. The problem was that people had already seen the real documents. The board's tactics were backfiring faster than they could escalate them. On the morning of the election, something unprecedented happened. People lined up. Not to vote for a president of a country, not to cast ballots in a political battleground, but to vote for the leadership of a homeowners association. Cars filled the street. Neighbors brought folding chairs and coffee. Strangers who had lived only houses apart for 11 years finally met for the first time. And somewhere in the middle of it all stood Valerie, calm, silent, watching. She didn't campaign at the polls. She didn't make speeches. She didn't beg for votes. She simply observed as neighbors whispered her name, as they nodded at her in acknowledgement, as they gave each other quiet looks that said, "We all know what's happening now." The current board members walked past the crowd like royalty stripped of their guards. Their smiles were forced, their voices tight. They insisted votes would be counted properly. They insisted the election would be fair. No one believed them anymore. When the votes were finally collected, they weren't counted in secret. They weren't tallied behind closed doors. Dozens of residents insisted on observing. State law allowed it. The board had no choice. And when the results came in, the HOA president, Greg Foster, was defeated by a landslide. He was not just voted out. He was humiliated. Valerie Hayes was elected the new HOA president by the largest turnout in neighborhood history. Gasps filled the clubhouse. Some cried. Some clapped. Some simply stared at Greg like they were seeing him for the first time. But something strange happened. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He didn't demand a recount. He just stood there motionless, hands clenched, jaw tight, expression unreadable. Not defeated. Not broken. Almost relieved. That was the first sign that something deeper was happening behind the scenes. Because within the hour, the treasurer resigned. Then the secretary. Then the vice president. One by one they announced abrupt departures, citing personal reasons and upcoming commitments. They didn't even wait for the transition meeting. They disappeared. They thought that if they ran fast enough, if they erased enough data, if they shredded enough paper, the truth would go with them. But they underestimated the one thing Valerie had that they never did. The entire neighborhood was watching now. And the final step of her plan had already begun. Because the evidence was not hidden. It was scheduled. The Zoom meeting set for the next day would be public. Every homeowner would be invited. And Valerie would not be speaking in hypotheticals anymore. She was going to reveal everything. Every transaction. Every fraudulent lien. Every stolen home. Every homeowner they had targeted. It wouldn't be whispered. It would be broadcast. And the entire neighborhood was about to finally learn what had happened to their community for the last 10 years. Whether they were ready or not. End of chapter 4. The morning of the meeting dawned strangely silent. It wasn't a normal day in Oak Ridge Pines, not for the residents, not for the newly elected board, and certainly not for the people who had once believed they would never be held accountable. The neighborhood was tense, electrified, suspended in a breath that no one seemed willing to release. For years, the board had ruled through secrecy. Now, secrecy was about to become their downfall. At exactly 6 p.m., the Zoom call went live. The board members who had abandoned their positions did not join. The old president, Greg Foster, remained conspicuously absent. But the homeowners arrived more than had ever attended a meeting before. Cameras on, microphones muted, names visible. The silent audience filled the display grid like a courtroom gallery. They weren't here for updates about pool hours or lawn maintenance. They were here to see the truth. Valerie didn't come on camera right away. Instead, she shared her screen. The first document appeared like a hammer striking the surface of decades of silence, a ledger real, unaltered, time-stamped, and verified, showing payments that should never have existed. The chat exploded instantly. But Valerie didn't read it yet. She continued. She moved through the documents one at a time, methodically, without emotion. HOA dues transferred into an account labeled Maintenance Reserve had been rerouted to personal accounts. Landscaping fees paid to companies owned by relatives. Thousands of dollars in attorney fees that never went to legal consultations but instead to shell corporations that had nothing to do with property law. And then came the foreclosure evidence. She highlighted 3 homes, 3 families, driven into foreclosure by fraudulent late fees. Each property had been sold to the same investment group. Each sale had occurred within 30 days of the foreclosure. Each time, the HOA board had approved the sale without notifying the full membership, as they were required to do. The buyers had connections to the same law firm the board used. This time, no one in the chat asked if it was legal. Everyone understood what they were witnessing. It wasn't mismanagement. It was theft. She then presented the folder given to her by the anonymous accountant, bank statements showing payouts labeled as consulting fees, vendor reimbursements, and compliance allowances. All of them were traced back to personal accounts belonging to board members and their relatives. She wasn't making accusations. She was proving them. Half an hour in, the chat became impossible to ignore. Residents who had stayed silent for years finally spoke out. They typed messages describing fines they'd never understood, late fees they'd been scared to question, violations they knew were fabricated. As the chat flooded with confessions, the truth transformed from evidence into collective memory. The board hadn't just stolen money, they had stolen lives. Then came the moment that turned the meeting from informational into historic. Valerie opened the HOA's bylaws, the very rules the board had always used to justify their power, and displayed the clause stating that any board member found guilty of financial misconduct was subject to immediate removal and referral for criminal investigation. She didn't need to raise her voice. The law was speaking for her. As the presentation continued, something unexpected happened. A new participant joined the meeting. Greg Foster. His camera was off. His microphone muted. But his presence was undeniable. The chat exploded again, not with anger this time, but with attention. Everyone knew that if he was watching, he was finally realizing the scale of what had been unleashed. For nearly an hour he remained silent. A ghost watching his own empire collapse. Then, without warning, he left the meeting. And within minutes, the old treasurer logged in. Then the secretary. Then the attorney representing the HOA. None of them spoke. None of them turned on their cameras. They simply watched as their secrets were broadcast to the very people they thought would never question them. At the end of the presentation, Valerie stopped screen sharing and finally turned on her microphone. She didn't read a speech. She didn't offer vengeance. She offered procedure. She announced a motion. Effective immediately, the HOA board would be placing the former board members under formal internal investigation and submitting a complaint with the state attorney general. She announced that a forensic audit had already begun, led by a third-party firm. Every document would be preserved. Every transaction examined. Every homeowner, past and present, would have the right to file claims for damages. She didn't ask for permission to proceed. She announced it. When the motion passed unanimously, the chat erupted not with chaos, but with something the neighborhood had not felt in years. Relief. The meeting ended with homeowners sitting in stunned silence, some crying, some laughing, some sitting completely still as the weight of long-buried frustration finally lifted off their shoulders. But as the Zoom call disconnected, and as residents began texting friends and neighbors, celebrating what they had witnessed, one thought lingered in the back of Valerie's mind. Something was missing. Something didn't add up. Not all the board members had shown up on the call. Not all the accounts had been fully tracked. There were still gaps, payments that didn't lead to anyone she recognized, new shell companies she hadn't traced yet, and most importantly, an unexplained transfer made only days before the election. A transfer large enough to disappear with. The board members hadn't fought because they weren't planning to stay. They were planning to run. And somewhere, quietly, someone was already preparing to finish what they started. Someone Valerie had overlooked. Someone who didn't appear in any of the public records. Someone who wasn't on the board but benefited from it. And they were about to make their move. Victory rarely ends where people expect it to. For most of the community, the Zoom meeting was the end. The board was exposed, the truth was out, and the neighborhood finally had control over its own fate. But for Valerie, it was only the beginning. She knew what everyone else celebrated was only the surface. Behind the collapse of the HOA board was something larger, something that hadn't fallen yet. Something that still watched quietly from the shadows of bank transfers, legal filings, and the carefully constructed network of beneficiaries spread far beyond the borders of Oak Ridge Pines. For the first time since the election, she allowed herself to pause. Not relax, but breathe. The adrenaline that had carried her through weeks of non-stop planning had finally run dry. And beneath the satisfaction was a knot of unease she couldn't ignore. She woke early the next morning to the sound of her phone vibrating, dozens of messages from neighbors, reporters, and even nearby HOA communities wanting advice. She ignored them for now. The neighborhood had regained its voice. But her fight wasn't finished yet. The forensic audit team arrived the next day. They were professionals, independent, quietly serious, uninterested in neighborhood drama. They moved boxes, photographed records, mirrored hard drives, and documented every file the old board had left behind. But something was immediately obvious: they hadn't left much behind at all. The office was nearly empty. Printers were gone. Laptops missing. Filing cabinets half cleaned out. The digital records were scattered across multiple storage accounts, some wiped, some incomplete, and some locked behind passwords no one had access to. It looked like a retreat, not a resignation. And then the auditors made the discovery that changed everything. A hidden ledger. Not digital. Paper. Handwritten. Tucked inside an unmarked binder, pressed between old newsletters like a concealed weapon. It wasn't formatted like an official budget. There were no explanations. No vendor names. Just initials, dates, and numbers, huge numbers. Transfers that didn't match anything in the known accounts. Payments labeled with letters instead of names. And at the top, one phrase. Primary allocation. To the board, this document would have meant nothing. They had always seen themselves as the masterminds. But to Valerie, this was the missing link. The money hadn't stopped at the board. It had been flowing upward. Someone above them had been controlling everything. Someone who never appeared in a meeting, never signed a report, never ran for election, and never needed to. They had simply used the HOA as a collection mechanism, a funnel. Only now, the funnel had been cut off and whoever was at the top had just lost their supply. That's when the phone call came. No name. No caller ID. No words spoken. Just silence, then a click. It should have scared her. It didn't. She drove straight to the county recorder's office and requested public property transfer records. She wasn't looking for foreclosures anymore. She was looking for buyers. Not the investors hired by the old board. Not the family members used as proxies. Something larger. Something consistent. She found it. A real estate acquisition company that had purchased 8 properties in Oak Ridge Pines over the last 9 years. The company name appeared nowhere in the HOA records. It wasn't tied to any of the shell entities the board used. But every property they acquired had originally belonged to a resident who had been removed through fines or foreclosure. Properties that were then renovated and sold for massive profit. A company large enough to stay invisible. Strategic enough to use the HOA as a front. Powerful enough to stay detached from every public record. Someone had built an empire on stolen homes, and they hadn't lost it yet. When she returned home that night, she found a car parked across the street. Not the same one as before. New vehicle, tinted windows. Engine off. Watching. She didn't approach it. She simply turned on her porch light and let them see her watching back. The message was clear. She wasn't afraid. And she wasn't done. 2 days later, she called an emergency meeting not for the residents, but for law enforcement and state investigators. She handed over every file. Every document. Every ledger page. For the first time, the scam moved beyond neighborhood politics and into the criminal system. Federal housing fraud. Racketeering. Money laundering. It was bigger than fines and violations now. People would be arrested. People would go to prison. But even with the investigation officially underway, she still didn't feel finished. Not until she stood before the last door that had remained closed, one she had avoided opening for too long. Her own front door. The one that had first been taped with a fraudulent notice. The one that had carried the warning to drop it. The one that had been targeted because they thought she would never fight. Now, it was the only door left they could use against her. And she refused to let it happen. She signed legal protections preventing any further lien attempts. She filed public declarations with the state HOA registry. She created a neighborhood task force to oversee all enforcement moving forward. Everything that had once been used against her was now hers to command, and she used it not to retaliate, but to protect. Her home would never be taken. No home in Oak Ridge Pines ever would again. Weeks passed. The story spread. News outlets requested interviews. HOA reform advocates across the country began referencing her case. Some people called her a hero. Others called her reckless. She didn't accept either title. She had only done what no one else was willing to do. She read every page. She stood her ground. She refused to be silent. And in doing so, she changed everything. The old board members were eventually indicted. Some fled the state. Some turned on each other. Some claimed ignorance. But the paper trail was undeniable. Their legacy was erased. The property acquisition company, the real power behind it all, was investigated next. Lawsuits followed. Attorneys intervened. Assets were frozen. They had spent a decade stealing homes to build wealth. Now they faced the possibility of losing all of it. And what began as one woman refusing to pay a fraudulent fine became a case study in how corruption survives when no one is watching, and what happens when someone finally decides to watch. Months later, on a quiet evening, Valerie stood in her driveway and looked out over the neighborhood. The lawns still grew. The mail still arrived. The streets remained quiet. Life had gone back to normal, but nothing was the same. No one feared the board anymore. No one ignored the bylaws anymore. No one assumed the rules were uncontestable ever again. The HOA was no longer a throne. It was a responsibility. She didn't plan to stay president forever. She never wanted power. She wanted accountability. And now that the neighborhood finally had it, she was ready to step down one day when the next leader was ready, not just willing. But for now, she remained exactly where she needed to be. Not because they tried to take her home, but because they failed. And the most powerful thing someone can do in the face of corruption isn't winning revenge. It's becoming the person corruption fears.